All right, welcome. Today we're diving into one of the wildest and most important periods in modern history, those 2 decades squeezed between 2 world wars. If you're revising for your AQA GCSE History exam, then you are in exactly the right place. Let's get straight into it.
Look, this explainer is completely focused on that conflict and tension 1918 to 1939 paper. We are going to cover all the key stuff you need to know, and we'll break it down so it actually makes sense. So you might want to have your notes handy as we go.
So, here's our game plan. We're going to start with the peace treaty that ended World War I and see why it was so flawed. Then we'll look at the world's first attempt at a global watchdog, the League of Nations. From there, it's a direct line to the rise of Hitler, his big gambles, and the policy of appeasement that tried and failed to stop him. Basically, we're answering the massive question, how on earth did the war to end all wars lead to an even bigger one just 20 years later?
Right then, let's kick off with Section 1, A Flawed Peace. Picture the scene. It's 1919. The guns have finally fallen silent. The leaders of the winning side get together in Paris with this monumental task: build a peace that will last forever. The only problem, they all wanted completely different things.
And this slide gets to the heart of the problem. You've got these 3 main guys, the big 3, and they're pulling in opposite directions. You've got Woodrow Wilson from the USA, the idealist, the dreamer, talking about his 14 points for a fair new world. Then you have Georges Clemenceau of France. They called him the Tiger, and he just wanted to crush Germany. He'd seen Germany invade France twice in his lifetime, and he was determined it would never happen again. And then caught in the middle, you have Britain's David Lloyd George, the pragmatist, trying to find a middle ground. He knew the British people wanted Germany punished, but he also knew that if they crippled Germany completely, it would be a disaster for trade. So right from the start, a perfect treaty was pretty much impossible.
And that brings us to a word you absolutely have to know for your exam: diktat. It means a dictated peace. And this is exactly how the Germans saw the Treaty of Versailles. See, they weren't invited to the talks. They were just shown the final document and told, sign here. Imagine that. This feeling of a forced, humiliated peace would poison German politics for decades.
And what were the terms of this diktat? Well, they were brutal. Germany lost huge chunks of valuable land and all of its colonies. Its military was basically dismantled. A tiny army, no air force, and its border with France, the Rhineland, was made a military-free zone. But the 2 that really stung, the ones that caused the most anger, were war guilt and reparations. Article 231, the War Guilt Clause, forced Germany to take 100% of the blame for the war. Then they were handed a bill for £6.6 billion. Every single one of these terms was like a seed of resentment, just waiting for someone like Hitler to come along and water.
Okay, so with this shaky peace in place, the world needed a referee, right? That brings us to Section 2. The big idea, the great hope for the future, was Woodrow Wilson's baby, the League of Nations. The plan was pretty simple. Create a kind of international club where countries could sort out their problems by talking instead of shooting.
On paper, the League's method looked pretty solid. Step 1. If a country steps out of line, you give it a public telling off. Step 2. If they don't listen, you hit them in the wallet with economic sanctions. Everyone stops trading with them. And step 3, the last resort. Everyone combines their armies and uses force. Sounds logical, doesn't it? Well, the reality was a bit different.
Yeah, about that plan, it had some massive, fatal flaws right from the get-go. First, can you believe this? The USA, the country whose president came up with the whole idea, never actually joined. Then you've got other big players like Germany and the USSR who weren't allowed in at the start. The League had no army of its own, so it had to ask its members nicely if they wouldn't mind lending theirs. And maybe the worst part, decisions had to be unanimous. That meant one single country could say no and stop the entire world from acting. It was a recipe for disaster.
Now, to be fair, it wasn't a complete failure, especially not in the 1920s. It did sort out some smaller arguments between smaller countries, like with the Åland Islands. But look at the failures. When a major power like Italy was the bad guy in Corfu, the League just backed down. And that set a really dangerous example. It showed that the League could handle schoolyard squabbles, but not a real fight with a big bully.
And that leads us to this perfect summary. People at the time started calling the League a body with no teeth, all bark and no bite. It could say all the right things, but it had no real power to make anyone listen.
And if the 1920s showed the cracks, the 1930s blew the whole thing wide open. First, Japan invades Manchuria in China. The League takes a year, A whole year to write a report telling them to stop. Japan basically laughed, ignored it, and just walked out of the League. Then, a few years later, Italy invades Abyssinia. This time the League does impose sanctions, but they're weak. And behind the scenes, Britain and France were trying to cut a secret deal with Italy anyway. These two events just destroy the League's reputation. It was game over.
So the world's watchdog is officially toothless. This creates a massive power vacuum in Europe, and that sets the stage perfectly for a new kind of leader to step in. In 1933, Adolf Hitler becomes leader of Germany, and his entire political career is built on one simple promise: to tear up the Treaty of Versailles.
So let's get into his strategy, because it was clever in a twisted way. Hitler's foreign policy wasn't just one big act of aggression. It was a series of steps, a series of calculated gambles. It was like he was playing poker, raising the stakes just a little bit each time, testing Britain and France to see if they would call his bluff.
And you can see the whole story right here on this timeline. In 1935, he just openly starts rearming Germany, a massive violation of the treaty. And what happens? Nothing. So in 1936, he takes an even bigger gamble. He marches his troops back into the Rhineland, right on France's border. His own generals were freaking out. They were sure France would attack. But again, silence. Emboldened, he annexes Austria in 1938, the Anschluss. Then he turns his attention to Czechoslovakia. Every single step you see here is another nail in the coffin of the Versailles Treaty, another giant leap towards war.
Which brings us to the big question, right? Why? Why did powerful countries like Britain and France just stand by and let him get away with it all? The answer is this controversial policy we're going to look at in Section 5, appeasement. Appeasement is a key term. It literally means giving a bully what they want in the hopes they'll leave you alone. And you have to understand, this policy, led by British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, was actually incredibly popular at the time. A lot of people in Britain felt that the Treaty of Versailles had been too harsh. And more than anything, nobody, and I mean nobody, wanted a repeat of the slaughter of World War I. The thinking was, okay, maybe if we let Hitler correct the bits of the treaty that are unfair, he'll be satisfied and we can all avoid another war.
And 1938 was the ultimate test of this policy. Hitler was now demanding the Sudetenland, which was a part of Czechoslovakia, with a lot of German speakers. War seemed days, even hours away. So Chamberlain gets on a plane, not once, not twice, but 3 times, to fly to Germany and meet Hitler, culminating in the Munich Agreement. At Munich, Britain and France basically gave Hitler the Sudetenland. The Czechs, by the way, weren't even invited.
Chamberlain flew back to London a hero. He stepped off the plane, he waved this little piece of paper signed by Hitler, and he told the cheering crowds he had secured peace for our time. People were literally crying with relief in the streets. War had been avoided. But that peace, it wouldn't even last a year.
Because just 6 months later, in March 1939, Hitler tore up his promise and his tanks rolled into the rest of Czechoslovakia. This was the moment of truth. This wasn't about uniting German speakers anymore. This was about conquest. It proved Hitler could not be trusted. The game was up. Appeasement had totally, completely failed.
But there was one last jaw-dropping twist to come in August 1939. Hitler, the world's #1 anti-communist, signed a peace treaty with Joseph Stalin, the communist leader of the Soviet Union. It stunned everybody. It was like a pact between fire and ice. But secretly, it was a gangster's deal. They agreed to carve up Poland between them. This was the final green light for Hitler. He could now invade Poland without worrying about fighting a war on 2 fronts. The path to war was wide open. Okay, we have covered a ton of ground. Let's get to our final section and boil this all down. What are the absolute must-know takeaways for your exam? Look at how it all connects. It's like a chain of dominoes falling. A harsh treaty creates deep resentment. The organization designed to keep the peace is born weak and toothless. An aggressive dictator brilliantly exploits those weaknesses. The desire to avoid war at all costs leads to a policy of appeasement that just makes him bolder. And a cynical pact at the end removes the very last obstacle to war. It's a direct line of cause and effect, all the way from Versailles in 1919 to Poland in 1939.
And so I'll leave you with this, the big question that really sits at the heart of this entire topic, and something to really get your teeth into for your essays. Was the Second World War simply Hitler's war, the result of one evil man's ambition? Or was it actually the world's failure, a collective failure to build a real and lasting peace from the ashes of the First War? Think about that. Thanks for sticking with me.